Welcome everybody to the Philosophy Research Seminar and joint event with the Philosophy Society. I'm just going to hand over to Ruben Brooke, who's the president of the Philosophy Society, to introduce our speaker.
Great, thank you all for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this week, Fr Stephen Wang, who is the University Chaplain at Newman House, just around the corner, if anyone's ever been there. And Fr Stephen is speaking on Aquinas and Sartre.
Existentialism.
Existentialism, yeah. The full title of the talk is Existence Precedes Essence, the Allure of Existentialism in an Increasingly Functionless World. So, let's run the course.
Pull this up because it doesn't go up, that's fine. Really nice to be here. Thanks to Ruben and Paul, I've known for a couple of years, and I've heard about the place for a long time, and I live just up the road on Gower Street, literally a 3-minute walk, so just nice to make the connection, and I hope it can deepen. And, Ruben just threw at me the phrase 2 hours. I don't really want to talk for 2 hours, and I'd say being in this room for 2 hours is too long. So I've got some thoughts and a talk. I've got white hands against white face clock up there, which I can hardly read anyway. So I'd say I won't talk for an hour, I'll talk for maybe half an hour, 40 minutes or something, and we can have some chat as long as we want, but we won't be here for 2 hours, I think. Good to be here. So, let me say it, I am an existentialist. I've admitted it. It's not a popular label. It takes courage to admit. I don't know if existentialism and continental philosophy is fashionable here at MCH. I'm guessing it isn't, but I don't know. Tell me. And if you'll forgive me, I thought it would be actually helpful for you if I explain a bit of my philosophical history, genealogy, just so you know how I got to existentialism. It might interest you for 5 or 10 minutes, but it does help with the philosophy that we're talking about, I think. How does basically an Aristotelian Thomistic, Thomas Aquinas, Catholic priest, become interested in Jean-Paul Sartre, the most notorious atheist of the 20th century? I guess I'm just naturally philosophically minded. I didn't use this language, but as a child, very young, I was fascinated by questions of identity, selfhood, time, change. The classic questions, am I the same person today as I was yesterday and last year? Does something exist if I can't see it? What is time? I remember, 6 or 7 years old, sitting on Dad's piano, just playing the same note again and again and again, thinking, is it the same note as the last one I played? I mean, this drove my parents mad, and I think it annoyed them, and they were a little bit worried about me, not just by me. I remember as a young child meeting new friends, finding out about their past, going to their home, seeing photos, and wondering, in a speculative way, did that past just exist before I met them, or is it unfolding in their telling of their story? It's the kind of Schrodinger's cat thing, isn't it? Does something exist? Do we cause it to exist by knowing it? I didn't know about Schrodinger at 8, but these were the things that puzzled me. Particle physics became the focus for me as a teenager. I was fascinated by physics, the paradoxes of quantum mechanics, wave-particle duality, the possibility of time travel, and the passion in me, I didn't know anything about philosophy, was to study physics at university. I started A-level physics and I just couldn't hack it. I got a reasonable single maths, but these geeky students who could do double maths and physics in their sleep, I wasn't good enough to do physics, basically. Changed to the humanities, to English and history. But it was a journey that got me still thinking about philosophy, and the journey of faith woven in at the same time. And I'm not going to talk about my faith, but just that it wasn't separate. The faith and philosophy and theology, they're all intertwined, for most people, I think, for me. I was growing up nominally Christian. I was an atheist for most of childhood. I was certainly an atheist at 15. an agnostic at 16, a theist at 17, a Christian at 18, and a Catholic at 19. A bit over-tidy. But because of that, I was longing to study philosophy and theology, and my undergraduate degree was theology and religious studies. I did this in Cambridge when the Tripos was actually very philosophical. So my tutor was Brian Hebblethwaite, and Don Cupid was a famous philosophical theologian at the time, and it was just a good part of my studies. Again, long story short, I discovered a vocation to the priesthood, was sent to study philosophy and theology in Rome for 5 years at the Jesuit Gregorian University, and this is where I fell in love with philosophy. It was a very broad classical course with all the kind of classical elements of a philosophy curriculum, and there was a focus on the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, particularly with two philosopher professors that were very influential with me, Kevin Flannery, an American Jesuit, and Gianfranco Basti, who's a logician, philosophy of language, of logic, who is still teaching at the Lateran University. I came back to be a priest, forgot about philosophy, and then after 4 years of working in a parish, my bishop asked me to do a PhD so I could teach in the seminary here in London in Chelsea called Allen Hall. And I knew it would be philosophical, so I'm kind of getting to the topic now. I was looking for a topic in the area of the human person, identity, the questions I thought about as a 7-year-old. Who are we? Who am I? And my proposal for PhD, it was comparing, really just looking at the work of Charles Taylor and Alistair MacIntyre. Do people know them well? Hands up who's read some of Charles Taylor? A bit. Hands up who knows Alistair MacIntyre a bit? Okay, a little bit, not a lot. Yeah. So a big book for me in Rome was Charles Taylor's Sources of the Self. A really wonderful book. And if you don't have time to read 800 pages, it's all really in his book, which is actually some radio talks. Is it called The Ethics of Authenticity here? It's got different titles in different countries. Yeah, I read it in The Ethics of Authenticity. Anyway, Sources of the Self. A well-known typology, and actually there's a very good book by Charles Guignon, is that how you pronounce his name, about authenticity, which summarises this as well. And Taylor just does, of course it's over-tidy, but it's helpful typologies. That we have a pre-modern self. I, the self, I'm defined by my relationships, by the community. It's a communitarian notion of self. It's social. Society is hierarchical, structured. I fit into society. Of course, I can break out a bit. I can break the law. I can become an exile. But I'm inseparable from my society. The symbol of this is my surname. Anyone's surname. Yeah. Who am I? Wang. A network of relationships. And actually, in England anyway, so many surnames, beautifully, including Taylor, come from professions. Yeah? Smith, Taylor, and many others. So you're locked in. You're the communal self, pre-modern society. Second, the modern self, for Taylor, is known as, jargon language here, the punctiliar self, or the nuclear self. The modern period, simplistically, is about individuality, autonomy. The symbol here is the first name, not the surname. Stephen, me, myself, I. What can I do? What can I achieve? I define myself for and against my society, my background, my family. Not just for and with, but for and against, both. And third, in the so-called postmodern period, I don't really believe in postmodernism, or it's dead, but anyway, in the so-called postmodern period, instead of the communal self or the punctiliar self, you have the fragmented self. or the decentered self, where I define myself not just for society or against society, but against myself, because I'm not stable. I am under construction. Not just I can change, obviously anyone at any period of philosophy or culture would say people can change, but the very notion of who I am can be changed, and can be changed by me, partly. Not completely, but partly. And again, are these just emphases, and have they always been true? Of course they have, partly, but it's just about labels and emphases, and it's helpful. I found it exciting reading Taylor. And of course, just to throw this in, what would our word today be for decentered or fractured? It would be fluid. That's today's jargon, isn't it? Identity fluid, fluidity. And also looking at MacIntyre, connecting it with Taylor, particularly, I mean, MacIntyre's book After Virtue, it's seminal, it's led to so many things, it's very old now. But just for me, it helps me to unpack Aristotle in terms of philosophical anthropology, not just about virtue and morals. It's not just that we grow in virtue or vice, that we can change morally. It's that we are changing through our own choices, obviously. And so, again, obviously, an element of self-determination built into the Aristotelian idea of virtue. And a phrase that's very well known, it's in every textbook, that I found very helpful, is the idea of the distinction between first nature and second nature in Aristotle. That we have a first nature, the givens, my nature in ordinary language, my essence, whatever. But we have a second nature, the person that we create through our repeated choices. That's an Aristotelian thing, isn't it? It's about repetition and habits becoming built in to the kind of person I am, and not just random acts. This is Aristotle's understanding of character. So the question here is this just about adding layers to the self? Oh, here am I, Stephen Wang, I can learn a new skill, like putting on some cosmetics or something? Or is it something more radical? Is it remaking myself and remaking the foundation on which I'm making choices about how to remake myself? Do you see? This is like pulling myself up by my bootstraps. I'm not just standing on my feet, reaching in different directions. Oh, I'll have this apple, I'll have this orange, I'll play the piano, I'll become a loving friend. I'm actually remaking the criteria that allow me to make those decisions. That's the question I had. And finally, we're at the topic of my talk. In my little life story, which I've come to the end of here, this is when, for me, the penny dropped in terms of my PhD topic. I was the end of year one, when you do a lot of reading, typically in PhD. I got all this stuff about Taylor and MacIntyre churning in my mind. No interest in existentialism, but I was in Blackwell's bookshop. I can take you to the spot where I was standing. It was one of those eureka moments, reading a paperback, which I've still got, about existentialism, and skimming through this book about the idea that the simple idea that in existentialism, typically in Sartre, we remake ourselves. It's not just that we make free choices. Many people believe that in different ways, but that we remake ourselves by making these choices, and therefore we remake the person who made the new choice, and either reaffirm or undermine the choice that's been made in the remaking. And the eureka moment was seeing that in fact this is the same, well, this could be a way into connecting this, for me, fascinating idea at the heart of existentialism with virtue ethics, where you have a second nature, where you have a remaking through habit and choice. And two ideas that had excited me, that I realised possibly had quite deep philosophical roots in common, and as far as I could see, not much research had been done in this area. So, to put it in a sentence, the PhD penny dropping for me, and many doctoral students have a story of finally when they found that topic after 6 months, a year and a half. To summarise, it was seeing that the idea of Aristotelian second nature seemed to have quite a strong connection with the existentialist Sartrean idea of freedom. And wouldn't it be interesting to explore both and to see if there were some deeper connections, or was it just a sort of superficial coincidence of language? And then, to bring you to the end of the PhD, I kept that bookshop moment right up to the end, but I ended up focusing on Thomas Aquinas' understanding of freedom and act theory, especially the interdependence of intellect and will, of knowledge and freedom in Thomas Aquinas, which, as I can say more about another time, is fascinating because it has this circularity of I'm choosing freely on the basis of knowledge about myself and the world, but actually the knowledge about myself and the world that I'm basing it on is also freely chosen. So is it circular? And the answer is yes, it's circular, but it's a virtuous circle, not a vicious circle, I think. And then falling on Sartre, I didn't want to read Sartre. Yeah, I had no interest in him, this famous atheist, famously, not believing in God, not believing in anything to do, throwing off his... He was a baptised Catholic, interestingly, because of his maternal grandmother, but just famously having nothing to do with God, Christ or the Church. And I was much more interested in doing something about Buber and Marcel and Levinas and some of these religious existentialists. But in fact, I just fell in love with Sartre. Again, I'm happy to admit that publicly. He has some weaknesses, but I think he's a great thinker. Really, a profound thinker. And here we are at the title. As I say, I don't think that's wasted time. I think we've been circling round the topic. Sartre's mad famous phrase, existence precedes essence. Existence precedes essence. And what I'll do is I'll summarise what I think Sartre's trying to say about that, and then I'll pick out some Sartre themes to help you make sense of that quotation and to see if you find it interesting. And I hope this is obvious, I'm not here to defend Sartre, I'm just here to throw out his ideas in case you don't know much about him, to stimulate you and to see is there some relevance and connection here with your own thinking and research. Can I ask you then, who has read Sartre? A little bit? Yeah. So a little bit of knowledge. And is existentialism part of the curriculum here, or?
It's a sort of guilty pleasure of analytic philosophers, isn't it?
Right. Is this broadly analytic here?
Curriculum, but
Yeah.
people read it.
Yeah. But do you have one optional module on continental philosophy or something?
There's like Kant and Nietzsche module.
I can tell you that undergraduate history philosophy ends at the Continental School.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Well, early days of the school. Lots of room to grow. Wonderful. Sartre was born in 1905, not to give you his whole history, but just the key text, even with his amazing later works, is Being and Nothingness, L'être et le néant. And amazingly, this was started, literally, without exaggeration, on the floor of his prisoner of war camp, in a school notebook, in 1940 when he was 35. And it was finished 2 years later in Paris when he was 37. And I don't think he bettered it. He's thinking, I'm thinking, we're thinking about identity. Who am I? And if you had to give an answer, what would you say? I won't play the school game with you, but just, who are you? What would you say? Would you give your name, your title, your job, your height, your genetic code? You know, there's lots of different ways you can answer. We all know that identity can change at one level. Obviously, we can grow taller and higher and older. We can't grow younger. We can change names and ways of understanding things and acting and relationships. And so at different levels, identity can change. Is there any stability then? Is it that, as I said 5 minutes ago, maybe there's basically a core identity to each person? Let's call it your essence. It's a given. Is it to do with nature or nurture? Maybe it's both. But psychologically, physically, intellectually, your kind of core orientation is going in a certain direction, and you have limited freedom to tack a little bit, but you're the same you, and there's a lot of determinism built in, not just inner determinism, your character, your desires, your likes, but external. There's a lot of constraints, a lot of, to use Sartre's, the existentialist word, a lot of facticity, essence. Well, the battle cry of Sartre was existence precedes essence. And just quick definitions. If essence is roughly your nature, your givenness, who you are now, your facticity, then that's fairly easy in English. Existence is more, not complex, but just, it doesn't fit as well in English. For Sartre, existence means it doesn't mean existence as in the foundation of your being. It's not ens. It's not the Latin ens in Aquinas. This is not about, as it were, static metaphysical being. Existence for Sartre, and you've just got to take this language, it's just the way it's translated, means you're acting, you're living, you're choosing, you're moving into the future. Existing, it's a verbal participle, and it's about how I live and move into the future and choose, right? So with that in mind, think of what Sartre's saying. Existence precedes essence. Most of us would assume it's the opposite, instinctively. Whatever your philosophy, just instinctively. Most of us would think that, yes, there's some freedom. I'm free, to some extent. Yes, there's some determination. But the reason why we do things, why did you do that? Why did you make that choice? You would say, well, I made that choice because of, and you'd give a reason, because of the situation, because of who I am, because of what I care about. And if you're a philosopher or a psychologist, you'd dig a bit deeper and you'd say it's to do with your psychology, your habit, your upbringing. If you've got a strong kind of Marxist, determinist interpretation, you'll say it's the whole network of society channeling in on you. If you've got a strong personalist view of freedom, you'd say it's to do with who I am and my sincerity and my authenticity. But when you're analysing the choice, the action, the existing, you're assuming that it's determined by, or at least based on, the essence. Yeah? Who I am determines how I live. But Sartre says this is back to front. He says, yes, with hindsight, the choice, the existence, can be understood in the light of your essence. It makes sense of it. But this is always after the event. And you can't actually say that the essence caused the existence. Because in fact, the choice, the freedom to act in this way, says Sartre, caused the essence to become the determining factor. You see, this is complicated if the penny hasn't dropped. I'm not saying you're stupid, I just mean Sartre's language. Sartre is saying, we think, I did this because of who I am. But Sartre says, no, the fact that you did this makes you understand your life as leading up to the point where you did this, and it makes you interpret your life in order to make sense of what you did. And yes, with hindsight, the person you were caused you to do this, with a loose sense of cause. But in fact, instead of essence, who you are, causing, determining, forcing you to act in a certain way, it's counterintuitive. It's the choice determines which essence you have. Right, let's give some examples after all this. Right, we need some examples. I'll give you two of Sartre's famous ones. You're a gambler. You're a gambling addict, right? You go into the casino, you think, I'm not going to gamble. Yeah? In fact, I saw, what's the film I saw 3 days ago? The poker film with Jessica Chastain and Aaron Sorkin. Molly's Game, yeah. So this is, go and see that, think about Sartre, yeah? Molly's Game, not a great film, but it's got some good poker in it. I'm a gambler. I think I'm not going to gamble, yeah? I'm strong. I'm going to have just a Coke. I'm with my friend. 10 minutes later, I've lost all my earnings. I've mortgaged my house, and you know, I've lost everything, and I'm a wreck, and I've gambled. Now, why did I do that? Because I'm an addicted gambler, yeah? I did that because I'm a gambler, because I'm an addict. Essence, who I am, is the reason why I did that. Great. But what if I hadn't done it? What if I'd chosen to not gamble? I'd have the same history, but I'm looking back and I'm saying, no, I was a gambler yesterday when I came in, but I've not gambled tonight, and in fact I am a reformed gambler. I am a recovering gambler. And I'm looking back on the same essence, this guy trapped in gambling, and I'm giving my life a different interpretation in the light of the choice I've made. And I can't, if I'm in this crisis moment of will I gamble or will I not, I can't look backwards to my essence, because I can go in two directions. This is the experience of freedom. Another famous example of Sartre's is the son with his sick mother. The country is at war, and he feels a call to serve his country and fight for his country. And he's torn. He doesn't know whether to stay at home and care for his mother, or go leave his mother, abandon his mother, and go to fight for his country. He's torn between being a loyal son, as it seems to him, or a loyal patriot. And he doesn't know what to do. Now, does his essence determine his existence? Well, again, if he chooses to stay, he will say, I am a loyal son. If he chooses to go, he will say, I am a loyal patriot. It's the same person making the choice. And the decision, the existence, is what will determine how he looks at his life up to the moment of the choice, rather than the other way round. We want to find reasons in who we are for making a choice. We want to make a good choice, a wise choice. What choice makes sense of my life? But this is where we can bring in more jargon. This is what Sartre talks about, the existentialist experience of anguish or vertigo, which doesn't happen often, but sometimes hits us like a ton of bricks. We are living a tidy life. I won't throw examples in case I hit on any that are real. You know, you're living your life with these values, with this direction, with these commitments, and you think this is my life, and you have a sense of momentum and duty and obligation. But then you have an experience of what Sartre calls vertigo, when you see that in fact you are free to change your life. Your life is not determined. There is an essence. You are this person you are, with this history, with this facticity, But you could do something radically different. In religious language, you could have a moment of conversion. You could be an atheist who becomes a theist who becomes an atheist, a student who's set on a magnificent career who decides to pack it all in a moment of crisis, a faithful spouse who betrays his or her spouse, or the other way round. We often think of these as moral choices, and some of them are, but Sartre's point is, he wouldn't call it this pre-moral, or bigger than the question of morality. It is about how do I move forward in the light of a past that is very weighty and determined, and I'd like to think my choice is clear, because we don't like too much freedom, but actually it's not. I could pack it all in. I could walk out of this lecture now. You could leave your studies. You could, lecturers, I don't know who's a lecturer and who's a student here, you could find a much better job somewhere else if only you took the risk. What's stopping you? Well, you don't know what's stopping you. You're choosing to stay. Great. If you left, as it were, great. Remember, this is pre-moral. I'm not saying there aren't good and bad choices. We'll come on to that. So this is Sartre's existence precedes essence. There is a weight of history and identity, but there's something about the human person that has the freedom not just to make a free choice. You know, that's relatively easy and boring, and analytic philosophy and every other philosophy has gone over that ground. It's about remaking the foundations for making the choice that's interesting in existentialism, I think, and remaking the self. So that's my summary of the three-word tagline. And I thought what I'd do now, I mean, I've thrown out probably enough to get us talking, but just a last maybe 10 minutes or so, this is slightly random, like a list. I touch on 4 or 5 Sartrean ideas so that you can see how they connect with this central idea of freedom and the remaking of the self. And as I say, in our discussion, just because they might take us into the area of philosophy of mind, philosophy of the self, philosophy of time, and just it'd be interesting to see what connections they make with the philosophers that you are reading. So some key Sartrean ideas. First, self-consciousness. Self-consciousness. So for Sartre, what's interesting about the human person and human experience is not just consciousness. That's easy. Sartre, in this area, is not original. He's through and through a Husserlian phenomenologist. Yeah, he just fell in love with Husserl. It made sense to him. It answered his question. Husserl was the answer to the endless battle between idealists and realists. Sartre grew up at the École Normale Supérieure. There were endless debates between idealists and realists in the first half of the 20th century, and Husserl was Sartre's answer. Where, as you probably know, and if not, you need a course on Husserl here, your curriculum's getting bigger every 5 minutes that I speak. Husserl, phenomenology starts with experience. This isn't Sartre, this is phenomenology. You don't have this crazy attempt that most philosophy has to extrapolate from the world to the self, or from the self to the world. You start with experience of the other, what is not you. Experience is the primary data, not world, factual, neutral, or self-experience, inner life, soul, not realism or idealism. You start with experience. And experience is of. It's about relationships. Relationship is primary, not how to unite two things in a relationship, inner and outer life. Relationship is primary. It's not inferred. So it's not about getting from the objective to the subject, or vice versa. It's about getting from the relationship to isolate for a moment the idea of object or subject. And the challenge is how to interpret them. But anyway, this is Husserl, it's consciousness, it's experience of. What's important for Sartre is self-consciousness. That experience of is not just of the other. I experience the world, time, the present, the self, my body. It's that I have an experience of myself. I'm present to myself. I'm aware of. I'm not just experiencing the world, I'm experiencing my experience. It's better in English, and Sartre said this, that in French you can't say self-consciousness. You can only say conscience de soi, consciousness of self. So he quite admired the English thing of self-consciousness, hyphenated consciousness. Consciousness for Sartre is intentional. We're transparent to the things of our experience. We're ecstatic creatures. We're being in the world. This isn't Sartre particularly. But it's the present, it's the awareness of my experience that destabilizes this experience. I'm giving my view now. Animals are conscious. I don't think, oh, what's amazing about human beings, we're conscious and animals aren't. I think animals are conscious, clearly. But I think Sartre would say, and interestingly Aquinas would say, that what makes us unique in the animal world is our self-consciousness. It's our ability, and I'm going to clarify this in a minute, not to detach ourselves from our experience or ourself, but to de-center ourselves. And this is a very continental philosophy thing, isn't it? Yeah? But I think it's fascinating and true that we are perpetually at one remove from who we are. It's not just I'm in this world. It's not just I'm me in this world. It's that I'm conscious of being me, and in the act of being conscious of being me, I'm not me. I'm aware of me. I'm at one remove. I'm present to myself, but be careful, I'm not a substantial separated self, a cogito. You see, that's the important thing about, I think, postmodernism. It's not a dualistic self-looking. It's not a ghost in the machine looking at all this stuff. I'm in the world experiencing it, but I'm conscious of that experience. In Sartre's language, and I think this is quite clever, and I don't think it's kind of cocky clever, just he talks about there is an identity that is denied. It's not that there is no human identity, it's that I have an identity, and in the experience of that identity, it is denied. He never denies, shouldn't use that word, he never doesn't say that let's get back to it. He never denies that we have an essence. We have lots of stuff about us. He never denies that. But he insists that there's an aspect of our identity that if we know about it, this is the connection with Thomas Aquinas, the Thomistic tradition, if we know about it, then we are, in one sense, able to get a perspective on it, which implies some distance from myself. And this is just pure Thomas Aquinas. It's that we don't just have knowledge, we have self-knowledge. I mean, again, most people in the street would say that. But the implications of self-knowledge for Sartre are profound. It's about the negation of identity, but without pretending there is no identity. I think it's very nuanced. This crisis of who am I? Well, I think I am this, but I'm looking at myself, and so I've got a freedom, I've got a distance. We only collapse that separation by acting. Okay, let me get on with this now. Will I give this lecture or not? Oh, I'm terrified of going to NCH. Oh, will it be wonderful? Yes, I will, and I'm doing it, and I've got rid of the crisis. Not that I did have one, but just as an example, as a possible example. I'm just doing it. I'm in the groove. I'm acting. I am the visiting philosophy lecturer this evening. But at 5:30, I could have not been, because I was thinking, will I and won't I? And I don't have to. No one's forcing me to. No one's paying me, I think. I don't think. You know, I'm here. And now I'm doing it. So we're constantly collapsing the distance and being, here I am, a lecturer, and then becoming aware of the distance and the self, self-conscious, a moment of vertigo, I could be someone else, and then I'm making a decision to act, and I'm stepping into an identity. This is completely different from the notion of authenticity. Do you see? For Sartre, there's no true inner self. You're not trying to be someone you really are. You're creating yourself by choosing to be this self. And the idea that authenticity has got something to do with existentialism is a bit odd, really. It just doesn't fit with, again, the genealogy. I was going to say something else about sincerity and authenticity. Okay, that's gone. So I'm acting, I'm existing, I'm projecting towards an end, and I could speak about this for half an hour, but I won't. This is, for me, this was my PhD, the connection with Aquinas. Because Aquinas, there aren't two bits of the self. You know, we need to interpret and make sense. The heart of human being, we're bodily creatures, but what makes us distinctive is that we have intellect and will. Now, these are not two separate faculties, like two substantial selves. It's the fact that our knowing, the truth about the world and myself, the truth, knowing, is always connected with my choosing. Where will I go? Who will I love? What will I do? How will I lean into the future? And I can't neutrally know, because my knowing depends on what I'm looking for and who I am and what I care about. The will loves, meaning it chooses to seek a good. There's an infinite number of goods you can seek at any moment. So it's not that the knowing is subjective, because Aquinas and Sartre believe in the objectivity of the world, but it's which bit of the world and how I know it is inseparable from how I'm living and choosing. The intellect and will are inseparable. If you like, to provoke you a little bit, the moral life is inseparable from the intellectual life. Discuss. And for Sartre, the project, and it's better in French because it's to do with the word throne. Is this Heidegger, thrownness? Yeah. The thrownness, I am thrown into the world, Heidegger, but I am throwing myself forward. I'm existing, to use Sartre's language. I am willing, the will, to use classical Thomistic language. You see the connections here. The freedom, the choice, the willing, is affecting the understanding, but the understanding is affecting the willing. And we never break the circle, but that doesn't mean that it's a vicious circle. And again, just to give you some of the language here, the essence in Sartre is famously called the en soi, French, the in itself. I think he gets this from Heidegger again. The in itself, but he does change it, and I don't know enough about Heidegger to know the changes. And the moving forward, the bit of the self that is constantly having to choose to move forward, is the pour soi, the for itself. And think of not just for, but towards and forwardsness. It's like I'm tipping forward, and the only way I can not fall is by taking a step. And this is like life for Sartre, choosing. I won't talk about this now, but we can we can try to avoid the choice, the freedom. We can say, no, this is nonsense. I'm me, and I know where I'm going. And for Sartre, this is a form of bad faith. Just to give you some of the language again that you've heard before, probably. Sincerity is a terrible thing for Sartre because it's pretending that you are not free and that your movement forward is very tidy, like a train on the track of my essence, my past. And in fact, you can never be sincere, but you can pretend to yourself that you're being sincere. Because in fact, the harder you try just to be yourself, the more, I won't say subconsciously, Sartre didn't like the word, the more you're aware that you could be something different. In other words, if you're trying to be sincere and authentic, why are you trying so hard? If in fact you don't need to try because you are you anyway. So you get trapped in your own paradoxes. And to finish, in case you want to, I don't know which direction you want to go in the discussions, I hope lots of different directions, but if we're saying part of what Sartre is doing, part of what he's doing is, in my Catholic language, we call this philosophical anthropology. It's the nature of the person, the nature of freedom. I don't know which module that comes under NCH, modules. The person, human freedom. We're also talking about act theory. So a lot of my PhD was act theory. And connecting that with classical understandings of the relationship between intellect and will. And in the language, the Aquinas studies language, one of the questions is Aquinas, and that Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, is it essentialist? Does it say basically of the human person, you are who you are, and your choices flow out of that? And my summary of what I've been saying is that in that kind of language, of the personhood, philosophical anthropology, I would say Sartre and actually Aquinas, they're qualified essentialists. They do believe in human reality, to use Sartre's language. There are certain facts about you. You're born in this time, you have this body, you can change it a lot now, but you have this past, you have this psychology. You are determined in many respects, and you're to go into questions of idealism and realism and epistemological questions, if you like. Your understanding of the world, of reality, is given. There's a kind of realist understanding of knowledge here. But it's qualified because everything we know, epistemology, everything we do, act theory and morality, everything we are, personhood, philosophical anthropology, we are aware of it and present to it. And that's the key insight of Sartre. It's the presence to, it's the distance from, that never separates the self to becoming a separate cogito ergo sum. He loved Descartes, but he thought Descartes had been misinterpreted by the tradition. Sartre thought that Descartes was not a dualist. That the key insight of Descartes, according to Sartre, was the cogito, not the sum. It's the thinking about, and therefore not being. If I'm thinking about something, even about myself, I am not the thing I'm thinking about, and I'm not the self that's thinking about it. And it's the negation in Descartes that was so important for Sartre. It's the distance within the presence, the distance to oneself, the identity not existing, but the identity denied in the same moment that it's affirmed. And I know, as a concluding sentence, it can sound, again, like so much continental jargon, but I hope you've seen, I think it's talking about real people and real experience and connecting with a lot of interesting philosophical areas. Thank you.
Are you happy to field questions?
Yeah, well, really, questions and discussion. It's that kind of group size, I think, where we can talk together, definitely. Please.
Okay, so I'd like to try and break down different types of identity that are present in this discussion. Because there's an idea of breaking apart from an identity, both where that's possible and where it's desirable. That I think changes based on which conception of identity we have. So that you gave the example of the gambler.
Yep.
If the gambler chooses to think of himself as a gambler and ends up gambling his life away, we could say that's a type of identity, a case of identity determining him that he is able to avoid and that he should want to avoid. However, the closer identity gets to who you really are, beyond simple labels that society or yourself might give to you, the harder it becomes to both to defend the idea that we can escape from it, and also to defend the idea that we should want to. So this isn't necessarily that defensible notion, but if we talk of some kind of limited human nature, then to what extent is it possible to escape from that idea of identity, or should we even want to?
Yeah.
If, for example, it's in human nature not to want to kill someone, should we want to be able to escape from that?
Yeah, great. Well, you brought in a lot of things there. You brought in the moral aspect, the should, and you brought in the is there a core identity? And I think I want you to tell us a bit about that. But just to clarify, Sartre, he wouldn't say you do or you don't have a core identity. He'd simply say, it's phenomenology, it's experience. To the extent that now you are worrying about this choice, then that aspect of your identity is in question. So it's as big or as small as you want. You know, shall you have McDonald's or KFC tonight? You know, you can go either way. It's small, but it's the question for you. Shall you live or commit suicide tonight? Big question. Again, it can go either way, and Sartre would say, leave aside the abstract question of core identity. The experience of anguish for you is whether to live or die, or whether to have McDonald's or KFC. And in that sense, it's not core or not core. It's just the fact that is what you're wrestling with at this moment. So he'd kind of slightly duck the question of core identity. But you brought it up, so let's talk about it. Is there a core identity to the gambler, whether he does or doesn't gamble?
You always have the urge to gamble. You always have the urge to gamble.
Yes, I would say yes.
And will his choice change his core eventually?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sartre would simply say no. He'd say he's happy to say there's a core identity, facticity.
Yeah, but it's a shifting thing. It can be a shifting.
It is. But he'd just say at any given time we're aware of aspects we can't change. So he's agreeing with you. Core identity. Yeah, I can't change my height.
Well.
I mean, back to Gattaca. Yeah, you remember the film Gattaca? She changed her height because she wanted to be an air stewardess. And she had to be 5'8", so she cut her legs apart, put an extra 3 inches of bone in. So she decided then that she could change her height. You're looking horrified. So, for Sartre, again, I'd like to know what people think. There is a core identity, but what's significant at any moment is the border between the core identity and the open future. That's what's significant. It's not that he doesn't believe in a core identity. You're in core identity, right, here's one we can't get round. We are in the year 2018. You can't live in 1963. So that's facticity. Do you want to say a bit more about core identity?
Yes, okay.
Because it's fascinating.
Yes. That seems to suggest that what we take as core identity changes on the context that's given by the choice.
No, that is Sartre, yeah.
Yeah. So then the gambler, it seems like in the choice of him choosing between gambling his life away and not gambling, his core identity that's a question is being a gambler. I can see how that would work. And I can see how there'd be bigger and smaller contexts, but bigger and smaller ideas of core identity that depend on the context, like the choice between KFC and McDonald's, or between suicide and living another day. But I'm not sure that it seems like there are some contexts where the idea of personal identity seems to fight back a little bit and can't be challenged in the same way it is by those choices.
Absolutely. He'd agree with you, but he'd say, sorry, let's come to you, Ruben, just let me get this out, because I think you've got to the heart of Sartre. He'd say, but the interesting thing is, we think something is really, really core identity until the moment when we don't. You see?
Yeah.
That's the point of anguish, is I think, you know, I'm a dad, I'm a father, you know, this is who I am. And I will never betray my spouse. I'm a mother, I'm a wife, and then something challenges us, we fall in love, and we think, actually, all the things I've thought were absolutely fundamental about my identity, in this experience of vertigo, are not so secure, and that's what's frightening me now, and exciting me. And it's the cliff walking. Most of us, most of the time, are not thinking of suicide, right? Many are, and it's a heartbreaking reality. Most of us are not. But how many of us, have not thought about suicide when we're walking along a cliff edge without a guardrail? We've thought, my God, I could jump off here. And I never thought that I was a person that could until now. And as I say, that's what Sartre would kind of smile and say, yeah, that's fine, yeah, I agree, core identity, you tell me what your core identity is, and then life is going to surprise you because you'll be questioning that when you weren't expecting to question it. And the very fact that you don't want to question it is the experience, is why he uses that negative word of vertigo. Come on, Ruben.
No, I'm interested in a related concept of core identity, which is the true self. I listened to a talk from a cognitive psychologist called Josh No, who did empirical studies, a series of experiments on what it is that we implicitly assume about other people's true self. And he gave an interesting example, which relates to the gambler example that you gave, which is if we know a heroin addict who has this addiction and does what the gambler does. One day he just goes cold turkey. That for many of us, myself included, there would be a tendency to say that was his true self. He was resisting this addiction. Yet in another situation where somebody who doesn't take heroin suddenly starts injecting heroin, it's very unlikely that we would take that moment of choice as expressing what that true self is. And whether in existentialism there is a tendency to, when people do make these free choices, associate their true self with ones that we would attach some kind of positive.
Sorry, was this psychologist, was it?
He was a philosopher and a cognitive psychologist.
Was this person saying that there was a true self in each of those two choices?
It's more like sociology.
What we would think.
About those kinds of situations.
You see, the problem for me is I'm too influenced by Sartre in this area. Sartre would say neither of those was true self. They were the self that emerging through the choice. Yeah. And actually, personally, and this isn't Sartre, I wouldn't say one is the true self. I mean, I completely understand someone having some wonderful drug that gives them an amazing experience, and I completely understand a heroin addict wanting to stop. I mean, they're both completely understandable to me. What were you... Sorry, come on in.
No, I was just thinking, well, then the true self had nothing to do with those...
Not for Sartre.
Because those were just choices. That was part of existence.
Yeah. Again, we're leaving morals aside here. But for Sartre, no. It's not that he would say, great. He would say, it's terrible you're having heroin and killing yourself. But he would just say there's nothing more true about the guy coming off heroin than the guy going on to heroin. And actually, psychologically and morally, they're both completely understandable, aren't they?
Except if you're born with a heroin addiction. You can be born with one, right?
Yes, but again, that's completely understandable. I mean, we're all born with stuff, for Sartre. We're all born with inclinations and habits and nature and nurture and propensities. So I just mean in his philosophical scheme, I'm not saying he's at peace with someone being a heroin addict at all, but he can understand how we're both influenced by our past, by who we are, the essence, and yet there are still moments when we're aware of being able to go in different directions. That again, there's a fairly simple point being made there, but it might go against what we intuitively think is, because a lot of us in our culture, we do think about the true self and authenticity, don't we? Do you think we do?
You just go in the bookshop and you'll see shelves and shelves on that topic.
Yeah.
Can I ask about sorry?
Yeah.
About the heroin, it's just, if you are a heroin addict, surely there's some sense in which once you're on it, it's going to keep you doing it. In other words, it's going to affect your ability to make these choices going forward in a way that is essential rather than in terms of your actual choice.
Yes, and again, this isn't.
I haven't written enough Sartre, so I don't
No, I'm not
asking like
no,
that.
Sartre would say yes and no. Yes, if the facticity of this person is that they're not, able to use their reason and freedom, then yes, how can you deny that? If someone's so drunk they've lost their capacity to think and reason, for example, let's take a simpler example, which many of us have been in. Yes, Sartre wouldn't say the completely drunk person is as free as the non-drunk, the sober person. No, Sartre would say it's possible to lose your capacity for freedom. You don't have it when you're asleep, you don't have it when you're blind. Absolutely. But he would just caution you to say that within every experience, as long as you've got your functioning, as long as you're awake and functioning, there are moments of freedom. And actually, it's not about comparing more or less freedom, do you see? Or more facticity and less facticity. In every experience of freedom, you have the whole weight of your past and who you are, your essence, and a little moment of freedom to go in a different direction. That's what anguish is. And it can hit you in different ways, and it's unexpected. So I think he's not silly, Sartre, and he doesn't think that, this stuff, he's petulant sometimes, and the stuff about a prisoner is free, a prisoner can be existentially free. He's not silly, and he was very politically savvy, and in fact he became more Marxist and determinist as life went on. But he would say, and I think I'd say this as a Catholic moral theologian, and I think many of you would say this, the prisoner is not, I don't know all these different languages of freedom that you'd have in analytical philosophy. The prisoner is not physically free, is not politically free, but there is an element of moral freedom in the prisoner's life, and there is an element of existential freedom in the prisoner's life. I mean, the classic study of this was Viktor Frankl, wasn't it? In developing his logotherapy in Auschwitz. Yeah. Again, he wasn't being naive, saying people in concentration camps can freely choose their way into freedom. I mean, he was fully aware of the horror, but he was saying there were differences in the way people reacted to the tragedy of their concentration camps, and it affected how they lived. And he wasn't making a moral point; he was making an existential point. Yeah. And just a little footnote here. This is what I forgot I was going to say. In some ways, Sartre has been vindicated in the psychological world. Sartre developed a school. Sartre was very anti-Freudian. right? Because he was completely against the idea of the subconscious. Okay, the stuff going on back here, this is all facticity, but to the extent that we can choose and are aware of it, it's relevant, and to the extent that we can't, and it's just influencing us, it's got no relevance to our choices. So he was anti-Freudian. He developed a school which was called Existential Psychoanalysis. It's very specifically anti-Freud, anti-subconscious, and it's developed into various schools of existentialist psychoanalysis. And basically, it's cognitive behavioural therapy. Basically, before cognitive behavioural therapy was fashionable and vindicated scientifically. Yeah? CBT is the way you think about the world determines how you act. And if you want to change who you are, you have to think about the world differently and make choices based on your new way of thinking. And not think that you're trapped in the past. That's Sartre. That's existential psychoanalysis. So that's just a little, that's another school of thought that you can go into with Sartre if you want to. Let's hear from some different people and different ideas. Yeah.
So my question is completely different.
Yeah, good.
About, so going back to your example about the man going to war and deciding whether he had to stay with his mom or going to battle. So basically, I was listening to, that was a few years ago, about a debate on French radio with a philosopher called Raphael Antoven.
What's the surname, sorry?
Antoven. And he was saying that basically, so the conflict between Sartre and Camus in this example was to say that Sartre was basically supporting the idea that you should be more patriotic, and Camus was defending the idea of saying, well, no, you should choose your family before your patrie. And that was also in the context of Camus' book, The Pest, I think, or L'Étranger, I'm not sure. Do you know anything a bit more about that? Or
No, I don't, and I'd love to know more. And I didn't know Camus commented on it, so that's great to know, and I'd love to follow that up. I mean, in Sartre's philosophy...
yes, do you know if Sartre said anything more about this idea of being patriotic, or as in choosing between your country or your family? Did you develop more ideas about that?
Well, he was very strong in the little bits I've read about that example, and it's actually from the novel, isn't it? It's from his... It's not from Nausea. It might be from the trilogy, the war trilogy. I've forgotten.
Yeah.
I've just read it as an isolated example. In the bits I've read, he's using it as an example where it's completely undetermined and there's no right and wrong. So he's not using it to talk about patriotism. He's using it to talk about the existential dilemma we have when there are two moral goods. And actually his point is when they're equally good. Or rather, in Aristotelian terms, when they're irreconcilable goods. You know, when there's two goods that cannot be weighed up on the same measure. Yeah? The whole point of utilitarianism is trying to say we have diverse moral goods and we need to put them into the same metric. Yeah? Which is great for some areas of life, but most utilitarians and Aristotelians and existentialists would say there's some irreconcilable metrics. Rival goods, basically. It's not that one is better than the other, it's just they're different and we can't measure them the same. And we've got to make a choice about which good... Well, this is the point. We've got to make a choice about which measure we're going to use, not just about which good. Am I going to use the measure of patriotism or the measure of filial love? Because they can't be conflated into a single universal measure. A unit of happiness or a quality or whatever. And that's his point there, that you have to choose. And in one sense, again, the pre-moral thing, Sartre would say, I think, loosen up, make the choice, live a little, they're both good. If you go to the country, you'll always regret not caring for your mum, but you will be able to justify it and say, I believed that love of country was the greatest good. If you stayed with your mother and didn't fight, you'll always regret not fighting. You can't avoid that regret, but you will interpret your life in the light of the choice, or you'll make an alternative choice a year later, and then you'll reinterpret, and we can keep reinterpreting. It's not that the existential choice locks you in, that's sincerity. It's that it takes you a bit further forward. And actually, I mean, I'm really changing gear here now. Lots of my work is pastoral. Most of my work is pastoral, not philosophical, with students. A lot of the conversations I'm having with students, it's not about faith, it's making big life choices. And often I'm saying, and it's not because I'm trying to make them a Sartrean, I'm saying some of this, you've just got to choose. You know, and it's in the choosing that you'll find out.
Through the experience.
Through the experience, yeah. Now, I wouldn't say, you know, go to war, get married tomorrow when you don't know what to do, but sometimes we need to take a step. We need to test the water. And knowing that we can go back, which isn't actually going back, but it's going on. Yeah. What were you going to say?
Yeah, actually, kind of following on from that. First of all, clarification, I just want to check. So these choices that we make freely, for Sartre, it is important that they're choices about who we will be, rather than, like, the ultimate choices that we're making are choices about who to be, as opposed to, say, choices about what to do. Do you read Sartre? Because for McIntyre and Taylor and people, that is often quite important, that the choices are about the kind of people we'll...
No.
Okay.
Sorry, do you want to say a bit more?
I'd love to know your...
No, he doesn't think that. Okay. No, his point is that they're all inseparably wrapped up together. And actually...
But do you think he wouldn't acknowledge the need to allow one to be more fundamental than the other? Because in some who think we do think...
There's two questions. There's the philosophical analysis of the act, and there's the person making the choice. Sartre would say that in the person making the choice, we experience the choice in different ways, and it can be one or the other. Yeah? I'm not thinking about me, I'm just thinking about whether to become a fireman or a policeman or a doctor or a street cleaner, you know, or whether to help this friend or that friend, or whether to spend this money. I'm not in the process of explicit reflection thinking about me at all. I'm thinking about the object.
Although it will have effect.
But it has an effect on where my life goes and who I am, and basically it has an effect on my identity, because in this broad holistic sense of identity, which I think most of us would take on, identity is not just name and rank and serial number. Identity is choices and history and relationships. So in the consciousness of the agent, sometimes we experience a choice as about goods. Sometimes we experience it as about moral rights and wrongs. Sometimes we experience it as about self. But in fact, it's always about goods and morality and self, depending on how we choose to look at it. And then I think he'd say the same, he does say the same, in the philosophical understanding of agency and choice, you can always see it from both ends. You can see it from the goal, and you can see it from the point of view of the identity of the agent. And you can see how this fits very tidily with Aristotelian act theory, because Aristotle is always about the telos, but it's about the person that I'm becoming through seeking this telos, this end. And actually I'm defined by the end I'm seeking, which is why the final cause is primary in Aristotelian.
But that's precisely why I wondered. I mean, I'm really interested in this, because that's precisely why I've sort of always wondered. I didn't really know, but I've always wondered whether for Sartre, ultimately, because he does resist Aristotle's emphasis on a single philos, you know, the function of man, or whatever. So and precisely because Sartre wants to say we define ourselves, I wonder if it is important for him ultimately to make the ultimate self-creation be one that's kind of consciously choosing what kind of self will be, rather than just...
I get your question even more clearly. I think the simple answer is no, I don't think that's important to him. because for him, because as a phenomenologist, the experience of is always fundamental. So the goal to which I am seeking, I am striving, for which I am striving, I'm always defined by my end. So he's not fussed about what he would avoid, and this is the last third of my PhD, and I'll show you my book, and I haven't talked at all about this, is happiness. The goal, the fundamental goal is, he would say there is no fundamental goal. Or put it another way, that each of us chooses our fundamental goal, and other than the abstract notion of happiness as ultimate goal, there's no content to ultimate goal. And in that sense, that's hidden in your question, isn't it?
Yeah, maybe there is no...
Yeah, he would absolutely avoid the Aristotelian Thomistic notion that there is any content to a universal human goal. And in that, this is where Sartre and Aquinas break. You know, in terms of act theory and philosophical anthropology, they go a long way. But then, is there a goal for human nature that we need in order to continue being human? This is the natural law argument of Aquinas. There isn't for Sartre. And this is actually where he gets, I think, in a muddle, because he wants to be moral, especially in the 60s when he wants to defend a just society and he wants to become a 1968 radical, and he was, but he can only do that if he'll put his banner on the mast. And he's torn because he's saying, I want to fight for this, but I'm aware that I'm fighting for something which is provisional and deniable. So he wants to be moral and a hero, but he can't quite admit that there is such a thing as heroism and morality. And he stumbles, and it's a beautiful stumble because it just gets you to the edge of, again in Catholic terms, what natural law is, so how you shift from utilitarianism into natural law if you want to found the notion of the good. And otherwise, if you don't found the notion of the good, you only have choice, the choice itself as defining the good, rather than the good being good because it's good. So he can get out of the circle of realism and idealism, I think, in epistemology, but he can't do it in morality, I think.
I had another question which I'm going to leave to afterwards, because that was a bigger one than I realised it. Thank you.
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of answered that, but I'm wondering about, you said that Sartre found an answer to the debate between idealists and realists in Husserl, who was a phenomenologist. I thought that, maybe I'm wrong, but I thought that this school in philosophy is sort of predicated on the idea that there's that Cartesian dualism is true, that we have private and special access to our experience, and we cannot really doubt our experience. So I was wondering, how is it possible that can start from this point?
That's certainly not Sartre, and the problem for me is, very happy to admit it, I've read a little bit of Husserl, but I read Husserl through Sartre. So I'm telling you about, if ever I speak about Husserl, I'm telling you what Sartre has told me about Husserl.
Okay.
And so I can't answer it, and I'd love to know more about Husserl, basically. Certainly for Sartre, Sartre thinks that Husserl's phenomenology is not Cartesian, or rather, he thinks that Cartesian wasn't a dualist, that Descartes wasn't a dualist, that Husserl was the first person to truly understand Descartes, where Sartre's understanding of Husserl's understanding of Descartes, and I'd love to know, some of you are teachers here, so I'd love to know the reality, is that Descartes' key insight, as I said, was thinking, cogito, not as a dualistic, substantial, separate substance, separatable substance, but in Husserl's and then Sartre's language, an experience of the world. So Descartes' thinking about, I think about my experience, is not I have private experience and that's the only thing I've got. Because that presupposes I'm trapped in private experience and there's a world and a private self, you see. Husserl thinks, Sartre thinks, Husserl thinks, that Descartes thinks, it's the experience, it's being out there in the world. My thinking is not a private self thinking about an external world. It's the fact that I am in the world, experiencing it. And in thinking about it, I realise I'm not it. So this is where you get a cockatoo that seems to be separate. But for Husserl, there's not a deep self that's separable. Separable, I don't know what the word is. And certainly, as I say, hands up, I don't know the truth about Husserl, but Sartre doesn't believe in a private self.
Just always kind of taken for granted that empiricism, rationalism, and phenomenalism, however you call it, just in some way they all have this thing in common, that they accept Cartesian theory of the mind, and that's why they're all kind of wrong. And for example, one British empiricist, Berkeley, because he knew that this experience is actually ungrounded by anything. He became an extreme idealist, I think. I'm not sure if I'm getting this right.
Yeah. But please, can someone tell me a bit more about Descartes and Husserl and that?
I can say a bit about Descartes, but not Yeah, I mean, and maybe I can say something that relates just to
please.
the question that I had, which is about the metaphysics of Sartre's metaphysics and how that relates to other conceptions. So something that struck me as kind of missing from this discussion was any sense of modality. Necessity and possibility. I mean, we talk of determination and so on, right? And facticity and this kind of thing, right? Objectivity. But it all seems very much about what is the case, not about what could be the case and what must be the case, right? And standard conceptions of essence make a big deal of, right? On a standard view of essence as opposed to accident, right? Essences are necessary, right? They're necessary. Anything, right? So some theorists want to analyze essence in terms of necessity, saying an essential property is one that you have necessarily. Right? Others say actually we can ground necessity in essence, right? So that it follows from something being essential that is necessary, but it doesn't follow from it being necessary that it's essential, right? And so, it struck me that Sartre kind of has, from your account anyway, has no, his conception of essence is just not like that. It's just givenness, or it's about what is true, not about what must be true, or right. And that, I mean, in particular, I was thinking that feels a bit like what's going on here is that the Sartre's notion of existence is something like your life rather than you, right? So it's the history that you have, or it's the kind of long event that is just a series of facts about the choices that you've made, or whatever. Right? And at any given time in your life, of course, your past ones are done, and you're on the kind of edge of
an open-ended
allowed
future.
to determine the next bit of your life, right? But one kind of common sense conception, and right, of course, lots of metaphysicians made good on this, would distinguish you from your life, right? Because you, in fact, have this particular life, but you could have had another one, and so you're a thing, right? A particular kind of substance. Right, that, in fact, undergoes certain events, but could have been participating, or if you're a participant in certain events, you could have been a participant in other events. So you're a thing that exists kind of across possibilities, whereas your life is just one of them, right? It only falls through in one of those possibilities. And I guess this relates to Descartes, because for Descartes, on standard readings, right, the self is a substance. It's a thing that can exist independently of anything else, right? And that has that kind of modal robustness, right? It's a thing that is this way but could have been that way, right? And that's unlike a particular occurrence, right? A particular occurrence is the way it is, and if it had gone differently, it would have been a different occurrence.
and we're getting into questions of time here as well, which is, I think, I'm not sure I can answer everything there at all. Sartre famously denied any interest in metaphysics, so that's a simple answer. And I think he wasn't strong on going beyond, out of the human, really. So he was worried about human experience. He was worried about what we call epistemology. He was trapped in the idealist-realist debate. He was fascinated by Husserl. He was interested in fighting against determinism, as he understood it, philosophically, psychologically, and then politically. So, but he was just more of a philosopher of the human person, and he didn't go. He disclaimed metaphysics. So that's just a famous part of Sartre's history. And I don't know where he would go with some of these things, and I don't know enough about these modalities. I think the point about potential and possibility, and givenness versus possibility, in that sense, essence and the open-endedness, was very important to him. But again, it was about being in time. So this is to do with the negation, and again, the whole beautiful area is Sartre's aesthetics and the idea of the imagination. But for Sartre, imagination is only possible because we can think about things that don't exist. But it's always within the human psychology act theory, and he's not drawing out the implications of what it means metaphysically. He won't get out of the human experience. And I think that's partly a weakness, and it's partly just a limitation. He is not a metaphysician. Now, whether the kind of metaphysical questions that you're asking, if they were done well and linked to his system, would undermine his conclusions, that's an important question, which I don't know the answer to. But he didn't follow back into metaphysics from epistemology and act theory very much. I mean, his metaphysics, it was all in itself and for itself. And I think he wouldn't have had the same language as you, but he would have said, whatever we're talking about, substance and something that doesn't change and something that has possibilities in alternative worlds, okay, great, but let's come back to the facticity of what is now and what is not and what is possible. So that's where he brings in possibility. It's not parallel universes, but it's open-ended futures. So that's the limit of his metaphysics, I think.
Yeah, though, I mean, it felt a little like there's, like, what he's saying won't work unless he denies that there are substances and attributes. Right?
And
there's an important distinction there. Without, right, unless he says there is no such distinction, there aren't.
Yeah,
there aren't substances, right? That's what. Right?
I don't think
Descartes was wrong. Or traditional Descartes is wrong, right?
Yeah, I don't think he would. I think he would he'd be less interested in it. I'm not saying in a patronising way it's not interesting. It is interesting for me. He was less interested in it. I think he would say, yes, there's substances and there's accidents. And yeah, that's all under the heading of facticity. Even the accidents are under the heading of facticity. That's stuff. The key thing is, what do we do with this stuff? And is there any room for movement in this stuff going in different directions that haven't been determined by all the stuff? And just the differences between the stuffs, he's just not spending time on. But I don't think he'd deny it. But there are passages in Being and Nothingness where he kind of goes a little bit down the metaphysical path.
For example, right, on kind of self-awareness, right? I mean, I don't know much about Sartre at all, but certainly there are thinkers who think the way that the self is given in self-awareness is not as object, but as subject, right? And object is just another word for substance. Right? It's not given as a substance. It's not given as a thing. Yeah. It's individuated, right? And it has an essence, right? It's differently given. I don't know how to characterize it.
I think that's what he's trying to do in his own way, I think.
Right, exactly. And it seems to me that that's exactly what Descartes wants to deny. Descartes wants to say the self is a substance.
Yeah.
It's a thing. It's an object. Other people think about it.
Yeah.
Right?
And again,
and it doesn't change.
Sartre definitely thinks that Descartes is not saying that. Yeah, but all of that I'm saying now is second-hand. Now I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in Cartesian studies at the moment, isn't there? rethinking the simplistic way. I'm not saying the traditional interpretation is wrong, but I think there's probably more. Sartre and Husserl have convinced me there's probably more interesting stuff in Descartes than a naive dualism, which obviously we think, but what does that really mean, unpacked? Please, help us.
Just on this point, I was just thinking, because the sort of two standpoints, or the in itself and the for itself standpoints, or whatever, in Sartre seems to be important here, and maybe it's that with the in itself, the facticity sort of standpoint, then the self is a substance, but then it just is this long, it might be a substance, but it's what you were calling it, it's just this thing that's already
thin thing.
Yeah, it's mostly thin. It couldn't have been otherwise. The in itself couldn't have been otherwise. It's not the functional self you were referring to. This idea of it's not that there is a self and it's a thing and it's a functional
Absolutely
thing.
not.
It's not a functional thing. If it's a thing at all, which it only is from the in it.
And he'd go.
It has to be this actual thing.
And he'd go a bit further, and this is the anti-Freudian thing. But he just there isn't. There's just everything back there. And it's not me versus the world, it's me and my world and my relationships and all that I know and all that I don't know. And here I am having to move forward.
And in the for itself, there isn't a thing at all. So it's nothing, that's the whole thing. The for itself is nothing. So there's ineliminably those two standpoints. And on the one standpoint, there's a thing, but it's not punctual. And on the other standpoint, there isn't a thing. And the punctual thing is somewhere in between the two that he just doesn't want.
Yes, that's a nice summary. Yeah, no, but the punctual self, the hard self, is defined by the goal. We're back to your earlier question about telos. Is I'm living towards a certain thing, and we all are. We all have.
But that change, is that the thing that changes over time?
Oh yeah, that can change. That's vertigo again. That can implode, but that's the reality, isn't it? Our goals do collapse and implode at certain moments in life. Is that another lecture next door? Yeah. Shall we maybe have a final question? And because we've been going strong and. I'll naturally draw it to an end, but
I have a question which has nothing to do with Sartre, but with your time at the Gregorian University in Rome. I'm just wondering.
Sorry?
It's a flavour of the song.
Okay.
I was thinking this is a great place to study. I wish you hadn't told me that. I'd have gone away. I just said to me, "Oh, they really roll their sleeves up there at MCH." Go on.
Yeah, because I was wondering about how Hegel's philosophy is taught, received, and what is thought of Hegel's system among the Jesuits in the Gregorian University. Because I know that Karl Rahner, who was a very influential theologian, who was hugely influenced by Hegel, he was there for a very long time. So I was wondering how the two traditions, Thomism and Hegelianism, how they tolerate each other at the Gregorian University.
Yeah. Honest answer, I don't know. Great question. I don't know enough where it was. This is not really a philosophical discussion. Let me chip in though. It was quite a good place. No one's recording this, are you? It was quite. It was.
I actually am.
Oh, you are. Okay. It was. No, I had a good time at the Greg. It's one of the oldest universities in Europe. It's 450 years old or something. It's not as old as Paris and Bologna, but it's a Jesuit university, and it started out just as a school for priests, then for priests and religious, and now it's quite a big lay faculty. It's still Jesuit run, but a lot of people are doing philosophy and theology there because philosophy is taken very seriously in Italy, unlike in England. So, and the problem with the Greg is a strength and a weakness is it's very eclectic, as in there's no kind of school system, common mind, common research path. It's completely random professors. Traditionally, Jesuits hauled in from different countries. The Jesuit superior in Rome rings up a superior in America or France or Indonesia and says, "You will send me someone to teach metaphysics next year because I need someone," and they'll come. So there were completely different schools of philosophy. Some were Hegelian, some were Thomistic, some were postmodern. And to answer your question, I don't know where Hegel was in that mix. I wasn't taught by anyone who was very influenced by Hegel. And now I don't know. Certainly the Rana school is not strong, I think. That was an amazing moment in Catholic philosophy and theology when there were some really, really bright Germans bringing together Kantian philosophy and Catholic theology and doing this incredible new synthesis, which is maybe feeling a bit dated now, but I don't think there's a kind of strength of school there at the moment, and in that sense I'm not giving a very good answer.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to wrap up or...
Well, just let's... Is there a bursting question? Yeah. Yeah, please. I'm not trying to run away, but I'm trying to not let you be here for too long, as it were.
No, it's a big topic, but I was thinking about Sartre and political philosophy, and how if you had a view on the way in which he perceives of freedom, whether that's mapped onto the wider community, whether that positions him in a particular mode. Yeah.
Let's. This is a nice question, as it were, to finish with, because it's hard to believe now, but it's true. Sartre was the biggest philosopher in the world for 25 years, basically, from the late 40s to the early 70s. I think I can say that without... It wasn't just he was the French intellectual par excellence. He was the philosopher. He was the spokesperson for the post-war intelligentsia. And existentialism was the movement. It's not just it was a fashion like the Beatles. It was the significant movement, and it was not just Sartre, but it was bringing together so many strands and passions and needs. And your question, Sartre's view of freedom, in a crude, simplistic way, it did speak to the post-war moment. In France and Germany, not very much in Britain, interestingly, because it's to do with the notion of defeat as well, isn't it? But the post-war reconstruction, intellectually, Sartre spoke into that. He became the poster child, but it had political significance. I mean, he influenced philosophy, but he influenced the culture maybe more than politics in giving France, and not just France, Europe, a sense of the possibility of renewal. So having a crude, Sartre's existentialism, I find profound and exciting, but the crude version is just, you're free, you can be who you want, and existence precedes essence, and you can be liberated from your past. And taken to the next extreme, none of your commitments matter. Yeah? So yes, people left families and marriages and jobs and thinking, I've discovered Sartre and I can be who I want to be. And that's not Sartre's point. Sartre's point is you do have the experience of being able to leave, but he's not saying it's better to leave commitments than not leave commitments. His point is it's better, inverted commas, moral. You have an existential duty to freely choose what your next step is going to be and to take it seriously. It's not his word, but to own the choice. But first of all, the idea that you are free became important politically, culturally. Secondly, the idea that you are not stuck in the past and that you can change. And I think this is, at its heart, a beautiful message. Human freedom, the possibility of change, of conversion, of reform, of revolution, in its small r, of liberation. These are powerful ideas, and we all need them individually at certain moments, and we need them culturally. And France needed it, and post-war Europe needed it. But as I say, there's a next step philosophically, which is not Sartre, although Sartre naively let himself be associated with this, which is the past doesn't matter. And you see, I haven't mentioned anything like that. Yeah. So the crude non-Sartrean interpretation of existentialist freedom is the past doesn't matter, your moral responsibilities from the past don't matter, your previous self doesn't matter. Now, do you notice, to say it doesn't matter is a choice. So Sartre would say, yeah, you can make that choice. I'm not saying it's better than staying in your responsibilities, but it's a fact you can make that choice. So maybe Sartre opened a box of existential and therefore moral choice that wouldn't have been opened quite so quickly, and he did influence the culture. And then, more specifically, you asked about politics. That was indirectly a political moment. It was to do with the renewal of French and European politics in the 50s especially, but then more specifically, especially in the 60s, Sartre did get associated with left-wing politics and Marxism and Marxist philosophy and politics and ideology. And as I say, Sartre was torn. On the one hand, it was him looking, I mean, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, looking more into the implications of facticity. So he concentrated on freedom. He'd always said facticity was important, but he became more middle-aged, basically, yeah? The facts of the world are unassailable sometimes, and we have to take them more seriously. And the phrase that became important to him in his writing in the 50s and the 60s was le vécu, the lived. Yeah? The lived experience, which he was saying more and more, you cannot deny. And that allowed him to become more politically committed throughout the 60s, and then to become one of the heroes of 68 generation, of the 68 generation. And then it became a little bit crude and simplified, and he became associated with some terrible causes. There were some wonderful left-wing causes, and there were some terrible ones. And finally, the bit of the story is, just because I'm here as a priest, he certainly didn't have a deathbed conversion, right? That's an urban myth. I've had many emails from people because they see a Catholic priest interested in existentialism and Sartre, and I've blogged about this a few times, and I've had some really, I mean, it really is a puzzle. Did he have a deathbed conversion that annoyed Simone de Beauvoir? He didn't. As far as we know from evidence, there's evidence that he became, just as he became more open to the lived experience, facticity, I can't change everything, the scope of freedom narrowed, basically. He became more open to the transcendent and to questions about transcendence and metaphysics, as you just said, and God, particularly through the influence of Judaism. So just all I'd say is there was an openness to metaphysical and theological questions that he seemed to deny. Well, he wasn't interested in. Really, it wasn't he had furious fights about God in the prisoner of war camp with all these Catholic priests. He didn't. He taught them Heidegger. Right? He was not interested in God because he thought that God was the denial of freedom. For him, God was all about deism and determinism. Yeah, he couldn't understand actually the idea of transcendence in the Christian sense of transcendence. So he became more open to facticity, more open to transcendent metaphysical theological horizons. There's a tiny bit of evidence, and I've had one email from one person who said they spoke to someone who spoke to a Catholic priest who heard his confession. But I don't believe it myself. I think it's an urban myth. Yeah, I don't know how I got to that. It's nice to end there. But yeah, thanks, Ruben.
Great,
yeah. Very nice to be here. Really, it's a joy. My first time. Hope I can come again and get to know the school a bit better.
You have a blog as well, I think.
No, I don't. No, that's all.